I'm Roberta Pevear. I was born Roberta Gibson Pevear in Bethel, Maine. Well, I was amazed when I started out. I graduated from Gould Academy when I was 16, and a man named Joe Wilner, who owned a manufacturing plant in South Paris, hired me as a secretary right out of high school. And it was just a fascinating job. That was in 1947. And every day I talked to his office in New York on the teletype. And I ran the switchboard and was a secretary. And that's unheard of today. It was really amazing that anyone would hire me like that. And that was the beginning of my career as a secretary. After I moved back to New Hampshire, I have lived in 7 states. And after I moved home and married Edward Pevear from Hampton Falls, the nuclear industry wanted to put a power plant in Seabrook, which was the next town over. And my husband's family, Pevears, had been in Hampton Falls for 300 years, and he didn't want to move. And I said I wasn't going to go down and be dragged around in the mud, but trying to protest, but I would try to get in the legislature and do what I could from there. I was the only one from Hampton Falls, and there were the other 4 that got in were from Hampton, which was the bigger town. And I started out, I came in 4th, and when I got through 10 years later, I took top of the ticket. But the nuclear plant was supposed to be 4 units, the largest in the world, and New Hampshire wasn't supposed to get any of the power from it. And it just seemed outrageous that this was going to be plopped down on one of the richest estuaries in the United States or the world. We only have 12 miles of coast. And they put a nuclear plant in it. We did get rid of 3 units, but every time we almost won, they would change the rules. And it was very difficult. It was an interesting 10 years in the House of Representatives. In New Hampshire, we only get $100 a year to serve. And they call it a people's legislature. However, you meet, I wouldn't want to say crooked, but bent people everywhere. And I served under 3 speakers. And the first 2 were slightly bent. And George Roberts was the first one. And you were supposed to go to a caucus, a Republican caucus or a Democratic caucus, and they would tell you how you were supposed to vote. And I didn't attend the caucuses because I knew what they wanted me to do, but sometimes I didn't do it. And there was a piece of legislation that came up that was bad for Hampton and Hampton Falls. And so I went to the speaker and said, could I speak? And he said, I've already got 4 speakers for and 4 against. I said, but I want to speak because this has to do with my people. And he got right up in my face, and he was much taller than I. I always wore 3-inch heels because the men all looked down on me. And he said, listen to your leader. And I got right nose to nose and said, you're no leader of mine, and I want to speak. And he did have to let me speak because that was the rules. And they lost, not because I spoke, but I did feel good that I did get to speak. The main thing, I did stop the liquor store from being put into Hampton Falls. It was supposed to be out on the highway in Hampton. And the head of the highway department and the liquor department had slid it over into Hampton Falls. And the problem with it in Hampton Falls was they wanted people to be able to come off of Brown Road, in addition to the highway, to shop at a liquor store. And there were cows out there on Brown Road, and people didn't want a liquor store in Hampton Falls. And that was the first thing I argued, and we did get it put back where it belonged. And the most important thing I think that I did, we did a lot of things, but I introduced the bill for an evacuation plan from the nuclear power plant. And originally they said it would be a 2-mile area around the plant. And I got it up to 10, which included a piece of Portsmouth and a piece of Newburyport. And so they said, well, we won't count those. We'll just evacuate those pieces. And I said, if you think the people of Newburyport are going to sit there while this one little piece evacuates, I think you're crazy. So I did get those 2 things included. And now that's what's coming up the plant wants to get an extension of their license for 20 years. They still have 13 years to go, and the cement is deteriorating. They have found some of the vital wiring in water, and yet they think they can last another 33 years. So I'm getting involved at my age, back in the same old thing I was in 30 years ago. I came back east from Kansas in 1970, and 71, Edward Pevear and I were married. We built a house in Hampton Falls, and as I say, his family had been there for 300 years. There's no one left with the name except one niece. They've all died or moved on. And he was in what they call the Old Guard. It was the 103rd Regiment, and he served under Patton. He fought at the Battle of the Bulge into Germany. And he had been at the Navy Yard prior to that, and he didn't have to sign up, but he did. And when he came back, he went back to the Navy Yard, and he retired as a supervisor. And then, unfortunately, 20 years, he had Alzheimer's. And that was another whole new life for us. We were in an accident, and I had Eddie on the front seat with me, and a neighbor whose granddaughter married Ed's grandson, and she lived across the street, and she was in the back seat, and I had an aide with me to help me get them into the foot doctor. And when I went out on Route 1, a man came around the corner, crossed two double yellow lines, center turning lane, and rode 2 feet up into the hood of our car. And I dragged my brakes 45 feet, and I couldn't get out of his way. And the lady in the back seat was flown to Boston and died. And Eddie was an invalid for a year and a half after that. And the aide has never been able to work. And it was just a horrendous thing in our life. He was an amazing man, even with the Alzheimer's. If we were sitting together, he would put his hand on my arm and he said, "Are you all right?" And I'd say, "I'm all right as long as I have you." And Eddie was in there, even though the Alzheimer's had taken over. And I kept pictures everywhere, and every day told him who he was and who I was, because I didn't think I could stand it if he didn't know who we were. Police department didn't even give the guy a ticket. They said he didn't do anything wrong. They didn't take his license until I complained. And he had, his daughter said in the police report, "My father is 82. He has congestive heart failure. Not under control, the doctors can't control it. And he has a history of passing out. He got up at 2 o'clock in the morning, didn't take his pills, went to work in Portsmouth where he had owned an insurance company, apparently still glad-handing the public. And at noon he said, 'I'm going home to Exeter. I don't feel well.' But he went over to the other side of Portsmouth to Bratskeller and had 2 beers and came down the road and rammed us. And I hired a detective for a year, and we couldn't find out who he knew. He must have known someone. So I had to go through the civil courts because Rachel suffered, was in the Boston hospital and died, and she had children. And the aide was in dire straits, and I wanted to wait to go into court so people knew what they were doing to us. But I settled because there were other people involved. And I met this fascinating young woman, Kelly Dumaine, and she had just recently married to a man named Murphy, and she adopted me as her grandmother, and I don't have any children, so it's fascinating that her daughter, the oldest one, they call her Lexi, her name is Alexandra. She was either 2 or 3, just learning to talk, and they had come to the mobile home to visit me. And so at the end of the day, Kelly said to the little girl, "Come on, Lexi, let's go find Daddy." And the little thing was a tiny little girl, and she shook her head, "No, Mama," and climbed up in my lap and called me Gammy Berta. So right then I came to the conclusion I had a family. And now she has 2 brothers, and we're very close. Kelly was an amazing lawyer. She listened. I had worked for several big companies, including in Johnson & Johnson in New Jersey. I worked for the Assistant General Counsel and Assistant Secretary of the corporation for 6 years, so I had that legal background. And then when I moved to New York, I worked for Jack St. John of St. John, Rondon Bell. So I had a lot of background and would give her my suggestions, and she followed them, and we won. And when she got married, she wasn't sure whether she wanted 1 child or none, and I convinced her that that was the most amazing thing in the world, is for a woman to have a child and to mold that child, that human being, into someone. And she stopped lawyering, and she's been a full-time mother. She does have her own business, which she runs on the side. It's a sports club, and does very well at it, but her life is these children. And I also told her that when you get married, you need to nurture your marriage while the kids are little, because one day they're going to grow up and go away, and there's just going to be you 2 there, and you don't want to end up being 2 strangers, which I've seen over and over again. So they have a date night every Friday night, and every once in a while she'll send me a card thanking me for my advice. So maybe I'm a little bit of a success as a mother, even though I didn't have any children. I just am amazed that I've written this book about the Civil War. It's based on 200 real letters that I typed up, and 2 appraisers said they were invaluable because I typed them up. And amazingly, my cousin and I got it published in 2010, and now I'm trying to get it into a documentary to use in the schools. It's about my great-grandmother who came from Bethel, Maine to Lowell, Massachusetts, and worked in the mills. And she met a man who came from Vermont. He was a painter, and they married and had my grandmother and her brother. Then she developed a lung disease. 70% of the young girls, mostly healthy young farm girls, developed some kind of a lung disease. 70% out of all those girls. And she was one of them. And so my great-grandfather went off to war. He was down in New Orleans in what they called the Western Front. And my great-grandmother, Eliza Bean Foster's brother, Andrew Bean, was in the 5th Maine. And he wrote from the battles that we all know about, Gettysburg and all of those. So she was getting information from 2 battlefronts. And you can read this one-sided story about a horrible lifetime she had trying to take care of her 2 children. He has given money out of his pay, but it never comes. They constantly say, have you got your check? No, I didn't get my check. She makes this shirt, takes her a week by hand. She gets pennies for it. And so it just is in this little short lifetime, he is very religious, very patriotic. He can't wait to get home. So when his 3 years are up, his officer wants them all to re-sign up again. And he joins them without telling his wife. And he comes home on leave, and they ship him to Winchester, Virginia. He signs back up in August, and in September he's killed. And he was 30, and 3 years later, she dies of the lung disease at the age of 32, leaving my grandmother and her brother orphans. And I'm trying to get this made into a documentary to use in the schools to show the role of the woman. We always talk about the battles, we talk about the men, the heroes, but we never talk about the poor woman at home.